So welcome everyone. We're pleased to be here tonight with Erica Cirino from the Safina Center to discuss her recent book, Thicker Than Water, The Quest for Solutions to the Plastic Crises. It's a wonderful book. It's very well written and engaging, and we're thrilled that she's joining us tonight. For those of you who are out in the audience, please come tomorrow from 2 to 3:30 at the bookstore, where Erica will be signing copies of her book and available for further discussion about this journey that she's been on to help us understand the odyssey of plastics from creation to disposal. And with us tonight is the distinguished head and founder of the Safina Center, Carl Safina, who will introduce Erica to us. So thanks for joining us, Carl. Please.
Okay, always a pleasure. So a few years ago, I was asked to join a voyage sailing from California to the middle of the Pacific Gyre, which is sometimes called the garbage patch because there's a lot of plastic collected there. And this has been known for a while. I was very interested and eager to see it, but I had a conflict. And so I said, well, I happen to know a very talented young writer who is a colleague of mine and does some work with me, does a tremendous amount of freelance writing, is really, really good. I think she would be perfect for this voyage. So instead of me, they got Erica. I'm sure they were very happy about that substitution. And this led Erica on a years-long journey that has culminated in her first book, which is what you'll be hearing about tonight, Thicker Than Water. Erica, take it away.
Well, thanks, Carl, for the intro. Yeah, that trip, that decision that you made changed my life fundamentally in many, many ways, and the book is only one of them. So tonight I'll give everyone kind of a preview of my book featuring that amazing life-changing trip that Carl mentioned. So, yeah, as Carl so kindly introduced me as, I am Erica Cirino, a science writer, artist, and now author of this book that you see before you. So when I was growing up, I worked as a wildlife rehabilitator for about 7 years in a clinical setting, and I'm still licensed today, so it's probably the longest running thing I've ever done in my life, is take care of sick, injured, orphaned, and otherwise what word I'm looking for here, sick, injured, orphaned, or animals in danger, essentially. Anyone who needs rescuing, anyone who needs healing, that is what a wildlife rehabilitator is for, to help these animals. So in my early work, I came across a lot of wild creatures who were injured or killed even by plastic. So this could be a plastic balloon string around a leg or a wing. It could be a fishing line that has gotten down an animal's throat. It needs to be extracted. We've seen great horned owls stuck in soccer nets. It's been every kind of plastic situation that you could imagine. And many of them were fatal. So as I proceeded to continue this work for quite a number of years, I kind of got sick of just treating the symptoms of the problems. And most of those problems were caused by people, whether it was the plastic issue, animals being poisoned, hit by vehicles, displaced from habitat destruction. So there were a lot of things going on that I thought it would be important to prevent them rather than just treat the symptom the rest of my life. I had planned to become some kind of wildlife biologist or field expert or rehabilitator in my career, and that actually changed around the time when I met Carl. I was taking also at the time an environmental literature class, and I realized I could also use maybe my creative skills to communicate these problems so that fewer animals would have to go through what the patients I saw in the clinic were going through on a daily basis. So this brings me to the trip that Carl mentions. Fast forward a little bit, when I was in college, I quit the job at the wildlife hospital. I started doing freelance writing and graphic illustrations and photography. And so when Carl asked, can you please work with me? I said, of course, yes. And then I was offered to go on this trip, and it was definitely the trip of a lifetime. So I boarded a very simple steel sloop with 8 others. There were 7 Danes, scientists and sailors, and Chris Jordan, who is the internationally known photographer and artist and filmmaker who has depicted mass consumption on varying scales in his artworks. So we sailed through the garbage patch. I always ask people, what do you think of when you think of the garbage patch? And the answer I most often get is a floating island of garbage in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it turns out it is absolutely nothing like that. It actually mostly looks like a clean blue sea with large items floating by. This is a fishing buoy. Um, there were big tangles of nets and ropes, which we refer to as ghost fishing gear. So fishing gear is quite often lost or discarded at sea. And animals also just get caught and actively use fishing gear. But when it does detach from a ship and gets out of the hands of humans, it tends to kind of find other nets and ropes and creates these impossible to untangle amalgamations of rope and net and traps and different things. And it's just this really deadly floating mine almost, where an animal, if it swims into this, it'll get entangled, possibly lethally, often lethally. And scientists are just beginning to understand not only the physical, but also the psychological implications of being entangled. I spoke to some scientists a few years ago, and they had some really interesting insights on the behaviors of animals that had encountered nets and ropes and ghost gear like this. And it was not good. I mean, their behavior was very changed. They were much more cautious than other sea creatures. And so it's interesting to think of this issue. You know, it's not just the deaths, but it's these long-lasting implications for marine life. Here's a piece of a fishing crate. So this is kind of what the garbage patch actually looks like. It is just this blue sea, and it's not really a patch, but a soup. So there you see a large piece of plastic, but the scientists I was with, they were with an organization called Plastic Change, and we also had a scientist from Roskilde University in Denmark. And so our purpose when we were out there was to understand the scope of this problem. So what is the garbage patch? What is it composed of? How much plastic is there? These are just some of the many questions that the scientists were trying to answer. So here you see a close-up of a metal sieve, and inside are plastic particles along with a lot of plankton and other biological matter. That's kind of the brownish stuff, probably some fish eggs too in there. But that colorful and white confetti looking stuff, that is actually plastic. And so plastic, unlike many other materials, it never ever will fully degrade or decompose into simpler elements. It will remain plastic. It will just get smaller and smaller in size. And the main concern here is that you can see in this very sieve that the fish eggs and the little plankton creatures, they're about the same size as the plastic. So you think of a whale, and a whale that eats tons, maybe 10 tons of food a day. And, you know, some filter feeders keep their mouths open and just kind of swallow water as they go along, these giant whales. But other creatures too, like mussels, filter feed. And they can't always, some can, but many cannot control whether or not they take in something that's the same size as the food that they're supposed to eat. Some animals like coral have the ability to spit things out if it's not food. And yet many animals are eating plastic, and it's a growing concern to the point where it seems like almost every creature has eaten plastic at some point, including humans. So here you see plastic that we encountered. So to go along with this trip, we sailed across the garbage patch, saw a lot of plastic at sea. We scooped our nets and equipment into the water and found microplastic, which is the scientific name for any piece of plastic that's broken up into a piece that's 5 millimeters in diameter or smaller. And so we made it to the Hawaiian Islands. It was a harrowing journey that I detail in the book. I won't give much away because I think you have to read it to fully understand the situation we were in, but it was essentially our boat was disabled for a while, and we had to cross part of the Pacific Ocean, which was not easy. Anyway, once we made it past that, we were checking out the Hawaiian Islands and came across a group called Hawaii Wildlife Fund. And Hawaii Wildlife Fund has been doing beach cleanups on one particular stretch of beach on the Big Island of Hawaii for more than a decade now, and have been going almost every weekend to clear trash because it's just simply so much plastic that washes up. So I'm going to go back a few slides to show you the garbage patch again. So if we look at this image, from the coast of California to the Hawaiian Islands, this is known as the Eastern North Pacific Gyre, or the Eastern Garbage Patch. And so there's a water current there that's circulating in a clockwise motion, and it's spinning a lot of debris and trash that's collected in the ocean from the coast of California, the coast of Asia, and Hawaii itself, all the way to South America. There's trash circulating in the ocean. So when it is pushed by a current and comes up to the garbage patch, this particular current on the eastern side, it just swirls around and around. So there's a lot of trash in this region. So understanding that point brings me back here. The Big Island of Hawaii kind of juts out on the bottom. And so the gyre spins and dumps a lot of trash directly on a point called Camilo Beach on that southern tip of the Big Island. And to the point where you can literally put your hand in the water and just scoop out microplastic. So this is all microplastic, and that poor dog is going for a swim in what is a plastic soup. And so this is a really great picture in the sense that it shows the breakup of plastic really well. I mean, all that white and colorful stuff is microplastic. Camilo Beach is just totally strewn with plastic, and it doesn't matter how many times groups like Hawaii Wildlife Fund come to clean up, it's always going to come back unless we stop using plastic. And we know this because this group has been doing these beach cleanups, as I said, for more than a decade, almost every weekend. And the amounts of plastic just keep getting greater and greater. I mean, they pull 14, 15, 16 tons of plastic off this beach every year, which is a remarkable amount of trash. And especially because it's all people power doing this. So that's really an amazing thing. But again, this group acknowledges cleanups are not the answer. There needs to be something else done, or else we're just going to do this for the rest of our lives. And it comes at great cost to the wildlife living in this region and all over the world. But specifically, if we're talking about Hawaii, we have a lot of endangered species. We have a lot of marine species. Monk seals routinely come up on this beach. They're one of the endangered species. And the presence of plastic sometimes deters them from coming up on shore to rest. And I've heard the same with turtles, sea turtles. So hawksbills and green sea turtles on the Hawaiian Islands have suffered greatly because of the plastic issue. So this microplastic that you see, when it gets onto the sand, it's pretty much almost indistinguishable, some of it from sand grains, because if it's light colored plastic, but you can see sometimes the colorful pieces, and it tells you, okay, this is not quite as natural as it seems. So there's a ton of plastic on the beach, and that's a problem because it's releasing climate warming gases, and that's a new finding that scientists have been trying to amplify, because if there's plastic all around us constantly releasing methane and other greenhouse gases, we could have a serious problem on our hands because we have a lot of plastic lying around. What's more is that the presence of plastic on a beach changes the temperature of the sand. So sea turtles that try to lay eggs might end up with a completely feminized population of sea turtles, or a completely male population, depending on the temperature. But as climate change intensifies, as the plastic on the beach piles up, the temperature of the sand increases dramatically. And that could leave sea turtles without partners to mate with if they all turn into one gender. And so that's a big problem right now too. So talking about the far-reaching implications of plastic, it can do everything from entangling to putting a species into the risk of extinction just because it changes how they are able to survive. I mean, this is a picture of a parrotfish on the beach. I found a lot of dead animals on this beach as well. I don't know, I can't tell you if it was because of the plastic, but I know that, there were a bunch of dead fish. And that was kind of chilling to see juxtaposed with all the plastic. Of course, here is Chris Jordan, one of his famous albatross images. So Chris showed us a film on the ship. It's called Albatross. And it was just one of the most heart-wrenching movies I'd ever seen. So he has gone to the Hawaiian Islands, Midway Atoll, where there's a huge population of nesting albatrosses and other seabirds. And there specifically, like on Camilo Beach, that circulating ocean current drops a lot of trash. And unfortunately, the birds there are eating it, specifically the albatrosses. And it's just physically blocking their systems. It's really, really quite alarming. Even when animals are not stuffed to the gills with plastic, animals that have plastic inside of them. So this was a mahi-mahi we caught out in the garbage patch. And it had 2 little plastic pellets in its stomach. So these are kind of raw plastic pellets, or the plastic that's manufactured and then melted down to make the items that we use. So that was kind of a chilling moment to cut open this fish and find plastic inside and then go ahead and eat the fish. I learned a lot more after that point, which may or may not have influenced my decision to eat the fish in that moment. We were living on a really simple boat where most meals came out of cans or bags or boxes. So fresh food was really a rare thing out there. So when we found the plastic, it led to a discussion of why, is this concerning? Should we eat this fish, etc. The normal questions you might ask when you find garbage inside of an animal that you're about to eat. So we talked about it, and our expert on board, Christian Suberg, was telling us that plastic particles, especially microplastic, could contain toxic chemicals. And some of these chemicals are manufactured into the plastic, and some of these chemicals are picked up in the surrounding environment. So if you have water that has pesticides in it, or soil that's laced with heavy metals, the plastic might pick it up. And then because it's so easily transported by water, wind, animals, people, it could poison us as well. So we don't know, though, how strong this effect is because there are limited studies. My understanding is right now there's a lot of research happening or trying to answer these questions. But we went ahead and ate that fish, even though we know that the risk of having animals inside of, plastic inside of animals leads to a risk of contamination with toxic chemicals. We still did it. So I'm in the plastic fish club, I guess. I went back to land at some point. I went sailing a bunch more times after that initial trip, which I detail some of the trips in the book and other trips in some of the articles I'm writing now. But when I went back to Denmark, I wanted to follow the scientists and kind of understand how exactly is this a problem? Why are there chemicals on plastic? What do we know about this? And, what is it doing to us and our planet? So that was my journey to go to Denmark. Here you see a bunch of the samples that we collected on the ocean. And so I was taking a closer look. There are some ways that you can learn about the chemical composition of plastic particles. And it's also things that you can learn using science to understand, where does plastic go? So here I'm talking about microplastic, again, these tiny pieces. So when I went to Denmark, the first lab at Roskilde University in this photo, that was the step that I took to understand, okay, what's the chemical issue here? So I ran some tests using a machine called an FTIR machine. It's a spectroscopy machine for any scientists out there. And that basically shoots a beam of light at the plastic and reflects back into the machine. And there's a wavelength of light that reflects back. And that wavelength gives you kind of a curve, and it tells you, if you're a scientist and you match it up to other curves that are known, the known infrared spectrums of these materials, you can find out what item did this tiny plastic, microplastic piece, I have my microplastic ready here, what item did it come from? So was it from a bag, a bottle, some styrofoam? There are different types of plastic that we use. Not all of them are the same formulation. So based on this kind of research, we can get a better understanding of which items are ending up in the environment, which are ending up as microplastic, and maybe what legislation or actions can we take to prevent those specific items from causing the bulk of this issue. We find a lot of single-use plastics that are in the water. So these are the plastics that are in plastic bags, bottles, etc. So in terms of the fate of plastic, so we know that these plastic particles have the toxins that are manufactured into them, the toxins they pick up in the environment. We know that scientists are now trying to understand where it comes from, but now we're understanding where also does this plastic go. And it turns out that we breathe plastic in our homes at a rate of about 11 particles per hour. I learned this from scientists in Denmark that were at a different university called Aarhus University. And it was just fascinating. So I was watching this mannequin in use, and there are two mechanical lungs inside. So it's a kind of a loud mannequin. And the plastic particles entered the mannequin's nose. Those are actually the things that look like eyes that are sticking out. And there were fine filters inside the mannequin that caught the plastic particles, which was really fascinating, but also really scary because, as I like to joke, this was an experiment done in a Danish apartment. There were actually several Danish college students' apartments. And Scandinavia, the furniture there is just very spare and sparse. And I think of us in America, and we love our carpets and our couches and our window treatments and everything. And there's so much synthetic fiber everywhere. So it was really, I had a little laugh because I was like, oh, it's probably like at least double that in the US. But the Danes with their very simple furniture didn't have as much. But that, more studies need to be happening, because if we just know of this one situation, we don't know, in different contexts. And that's another thing with plastic, is that culturally people do use it differently. And we have different relationships to stuff. However, generally, we've been using more and more plastic as time has gone on, to the point where there's at least 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic made today, and at least 6.3 billion of those 8.3 billion metric tons, so this is most of that, has ended up in the environment or landfills, which is a huge concern, because if we're living on top of our trash, what are the risks to our health if we know that it's going to break up into these little particles that easily enter food, that are easily eaten by animals that we eat as well? It's in our water, it's in the air, outside as well. There have been many studies in the past 5 to 10 years revealing the extent of this problem. It's only really recently that this has happened. Although I learned from scientists, some of the old-time scientists, the originals who were starting this research in the 70s, shortly after plastic had begun to be mass-produced. Edward Carpenter is one of them, and he had found plastic particles in seabirds. With a collaborator, he had found plastic particles in the surface waters of the oceans. And representatives of the plastic industry apparently came to his door and told him not to publish some of his work. And he was working at Woods Hole at the time, and he told me that he was really concerned, but he also knew that he wanted to publish his research. And he thinks that he did not get tenure because that he pushed forward with his research, and that the industry complained and made problems for Woods Hole. So that was really upsetting to hear, because it's like, I spoke to him and I spoke to several other scientists who had been doing work around the same time in the 60s and 70s, and they were aware of the problem. Of course, not the whole scale of it, but they knew that the problem was happening, and they lament today, could we have solved this problem 70 years ago, or at least, started to work on solving it, because maybe we would have been much further today. I've traveled to many, many countries to understand the scope of this problem, mostly, when I can by sailboat. Otherwise, I use trains, planes, cars. I tried to just see the whole scope of this, because again, it is differing on a cultural level in different places, but at the same time, this is a global issue that affects everyone alive today. This is in Portugal. So my book, I like to start on the ocean, because that's where many people first have heard about the plastic crisis because of the garbage patch being this compelling, almost mythical place that we've talked about for the past few decades, but only recently have begun to understand. So I need to understand now, if we're getting to solutions, how do we handle this waste? Because currently we create an enormous amount of waste, almost an impossible amount. It turns out only 9% of all the plastic we've made historically has been recycled. And this number is a bit dubious because recycling numbers are self-reported, most commonly by municipalities, by waste handlers, and trash is cash. I mean, I hear this in communities all over that are working on zero waste solutions, but unfortunately, much of this trash is ending up near or in communities of color or Indigenous communities who face an increased level of pollution. Why does this happen? Well, there's systemic racism for one, which pushes corporations to make these decisions. It also sways the municipalities charged with protecting people in their communities to accept projects like giant incinerators and recycling centers, landfills, waste transfer stations. The list goes on and on. Here on Long Island, we have a community in Brookhaven facing the issues of a landfill right now in North Bellport. And strangely, and I've learned this as I've become more active with their group, there's an incinerator in my current community that sends ash to their community. And there are several other communities with incinerators that also send trash to North Bellport, to the Brookhaven landfill. So it really, waste is a strange thing because it really connects all of us. And the issue of injustice is a critical place to, I think, begin this this quest for solutions, as I call it, because it just reiterates the fact that there is no such place as a way with plastic. I mean, it's going to have to go somewhere, and unfortunately, for many people, that means in their own backyards, at the expense of their health, also at the expense of their mental well-being, their financial stability. You know, if you're living next to one of these trash handling places, your home value is probably not going to be as high as people who are further afield. So there are many consequences for these communities. Rarely do communities have a say in whether such developments happen because oftentimes there's a real lack of transparency. And so it's not even like these communities can choose whether or not they want to have this stuff there. It's that it just gets there for some reason. And then they find out about it and have to react. So that's also really part of it too, part of the injustice that needs to be changed. So increasing that transparency is a really great place to start. And then also acknowledging that we can't keep wasting. I mean, we have a very high-powered, fast lifestyle. Here's a container ship that I saw in the garbage patch, but we're constantly shipping stuff and moving stuff around, including garbage. So I spoke to a bunch of scientists and residents in Turkey last year. They were telling me that their community in Adana, which is a port city, were suffering because of the waste crisis, the plastic crisis, because communities in the UK and other parts of Europe, they were sending their trash to Turkey to be dumped or incinerated. And it was under the guise of recycling. So oftentimes, you know, projects that are called renewable or recycling, it's just not true because there's nothing renewable about burning trash for energy. In fact, it requires fossil fuels to do that. It also requires fossil fuels to, you know, have cargo ships full of trash, you know, travel around the world. So there's nothing really useful about it. It's just pushing, again, the problem onto someone else, often, you know, in this case, a less developed nation. And only recently has Turkey passed legislation that has somewhat curbed that dumping and incineration, because what they were encountering was, you know, people would say, oh, we're going to recycle this trash. And then mysteriously there would be a fire at a recycling center. So it just seems like the trash was just set on fire. And I've worked with Dr. Sadat Gondogdu, and he is a researcher in Turkey who's actually mapped these facilities that have caught fire, and it's just like dozens of them. And it makes you wonder, you're like, okay, well, the people who are accepting the recycling are getting money for it, and they're not recycling it because that's expensive. So they're just going to burn it and say that there was an accident. So you see what the narrative is there. Here is the Brookhaven landfill on my way there. So this is a landfill that has been historically used for municipal solid waste, sludge, and now ash. So over the years, the DEC and the state and the town of Brookhaven have changed regulations, but it does not change the fact that this landfill is still next to a mostly Black and Latinx community, and that's not fair. It's just simply not fair. So something needs to be done about that. There is more environmental racism at the front of the plastic pipeline, and that was where my journey took me in my book as well. So you'll meet the folks in Welcome, Louisiana, in St. James Parish. On the way there, I drove past so many refineries, other industrial developments. So there's an 85-mile stretch of land between Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and New Orleans. And it's filled with more than 150 refineries, factories, and other industrial infrastructure, mostly fossil fuel based and plastic based. And as the climate crisis intensifies, as emissions regulations are more stringent, renewable energy is coming on the map. What we hear is that the oil and gas companies are now banking on making plastic as a way to use fossil fuels into the future, because they're not necessarily burning all of them, although some needs to be burned for energy to make them, but turning oil and gas, which is the foundational blocks of plastic, into plastic. And so again, these giant colossal factories, which can be thousands of acres, are often right next door to communities of color, which is a major environmental justice concern. I encountered all different types of factories on my journey, but the real change was happening at that time. Even though the situation feels so dire, there are communities out there fighting back. And so Rise St. James is a group founded by Sharon Levine. She's a 2021 Goldman Environment Prize winner for her amazing work in St. James. But she's rallied her whole community to stand up to the corporations, most recently being Taiwanese Formosa Plastic Group. So Formosa Plastic Group came in with a proposed $9.4 billion plastic factory, and you heard that right, $1 billion. And these corporations have an enormous amount of money, and to think they're putting these developments in the most vulnerable communities is just really disgusting and disturbing. And that's what Sharon's work is shedding light on. You can see her here next to Diane Wilson in the red cape. So Diane lives in Seadrift, Texas, next to an existing Formosa facility. And she's encountered plastic raining down from the sky, plastic in the waterways, explosions, fires, you name it, endless disasters in her own community. So she's been allying with Rise and kind of shedding light on, how she fought off Formosa. She didn't succeed, obviously, in getting them to leave Seadrift, Texas, where she is, but she did succeed in one of the biggest class action settlements for the Clean Air Act, because they were found to be polluting, and Clean Water Act. They were found to be polluting, and so the waterways in her community were completely saturated with plastic pellets and plastic pieces. And so all the work detecting that issue was all on Diane and her neighbors, who went in kayaks into these water outflows to collect these plastic particles, and then presented thousands of bags of them to the judge in court. So it's an enormous amount of work to be an advocate for your community. And it's just so important to support these communities that are on the front lines as much as we can, because they're doing the work that we all need right now. And, I just wanted to add that as a really important part of the plastic crisis. And this was a part of the crisis that, I was not even aware existed when I started the journey. And it was remarkable to learn of all the amazing work that's been happening literally for decades. And now it's coming to light as we recognize the importance of it right now. So what are the strategies? Well, you have to educate your community. It's really hard to stay on top of all the things that these corporations are doing, because there's a lot of permits, there's a lot of deals, there's money that comes and goes. And there's also the local legislators and regulators who are supposed to be in charge of making sure their pollution levels are not above what is deemed acceptable. So Formosa's application says that it will operate within DEC and EPA guidelines. Sorry, not DEC, the DEQ, Louisiana DEQ guidelines. However, these residents have serious concerns because look at Formosa's track record. You look at Diane's situation in Texas, and they were literally having plastic snowing down from the sky. That's a real big problem. So when we address the issue of plastic, it's not just an issue of what can we use to replace plastic? What can we use, instead of plastic? These common narratives, how can we clean it up? But it's really a fundamental value shift that we need, and a fundamental look at accountability. And it's not just, making the corporations that make plastic accountable, but it's also holding ourselves accountable. We all, not all of us, but most people alive today participate in a very fast-paced lifestyle, a very wasteful lifestyle. Plastic is a great material in terms of its ability to be so versatile, so lightweight, very inexpensive in most cases. It's also capable of saving lives. I mean, we have helmets, we have airbags, we have syringes. We think of the coronavirus pandemic and all the PPE that we've had. And it's exhausting at the same time because it's literally everything in our world. I often speak to young people, and I remember there was one student who was really freaked out once I told them that, the ceiling in their school was made of plastic, the floor was made of plastic, the table was made of plastic, their chair was made of plastic, their shoes, their shirt, and then the water bottle on the table, and that poor student was just looking mortified. But that's the reality of the world we live in. Even the device we're looking at right now is a lot of plastic on it. So in terms of, what could we do instead? I think we have to ask these questions first, and then think about where can we take plastic out of our lives, and maybe not even need to replace it. It's just about taking it away. Because to me, and I learned this while I was out at sea, that's why I thank Carl for giving me the opportunity to go on this trip, was that, life is so precious and the environment is so important to all of us. And it literally is, in my opinion, the ocean is the most beautiful place in the world. And it was out there that I really thought about these two questions, because we were living on an extremely simple boat, no creature comforts. The most comforting thing was my cold blue little bunk that was just too short for me. And the fabric was itchy and it was flat and tiny. And that was all I had for 24 days and for comfort. And still I had the absolute best time of my life out there. It was some of the richest days I ever had on this planet. So that was really an amazing privilege to be out there. I've also seen some really ugly things. I've seen how our drive to live fast, live with material wealth. I would argue that this is wealth. I don't argue that this is wealth. This is just garbage. You see everything in these pictures, from water bottles to sachets, these little packets, plastic packets that have coffee in them and soap in them. It's just, there's no need for it. And the convenience that it lends us, what are we doing with the extra time saved? Well, we're usually working to make more money to buy more stuff. And that lifestyle is just not one that is sustainable. I've done a lot of art. So on the left, you can see a woman, female body. On the other side, you can see a hand reaching down at microplastic. On the female body is a fetus. That was something I made when I learned that placenta has been found across the maternal and fetal membranes. So it's been found on both sides of the placenta, microplastic. So that was a remarkable thing that I learned recently. And then you have the other picture with the hand reaching down. That was just a photography experiment. But it's a reminder that there literally is microplastic all around us, whether we can see it or not. If you look closely, you will find it. I look very closely as I walk and navigate the world. So, you know, when I say we need to change our values, it's not that sexy solution that everyone's like, oh, you know, I just buy this thing and then every problem is solved. It's like, no, we actually have to do the work. So I like to spend a lot of time with young people, and I've done a lot of art workshops with Microplastic, and the folks at Hawaii Wildlife Fund, who you heard about when I went to Camilo Beach, they're awesome. And they send me plastic when I ask for it, which is, you know, to be shipped from Hawaii is not necessarily a great thing, but in this lightweight box, reusing trash and teaching people where it came from and what we can do about it, I think it is a valuable lesson. And it is a way to use the trash that they find without throwing it away again, which I find that to be a helpful thing rather than a harmful thing, especially when we can have conversations about it like this. So I'm really grateful. And, you know, in terms of teaching students more about this issue, I have them think about what is so beautiful about the natural world. And then I have them look at the plastic and come up with kind of a composition to depict that. So we have a beautiful sea turtle here. I've also done plastic sculptures with young people. So we have a nice jellyfish going on. Another one is being made on the right side. And then I've also done hands-on science with young people. Sorry, I have a dog in the background. So these young people were in Huntington, third graders from Maplewood Elementary School. And I took them to the Sunken Meadow State Park, and we did a trash survey on the beach. After collecting the trash and collecting data on what we found, they made art. This was called a fun day at the beach. They said, this looks like my dad when he goes to the beach. So he has a nice beer and he's just having a good time. Anyway, to go off this point though, with the science, I really think it's important to let people know that you don't have to be a scientist to do science or to understand the natural world. I've seen so much amazing community science out there and engaged in it with young people myself, and it's a great way to learn more about the world that we live in. So, you know, from trash surveys to making art, there's so many ways we can engage with the people and the communities around us, young, old, and in between. So it's just something I recommend is to get out there, and that's what I did. I could have been a journalist who, you know, sat behind a desk all day, which is no problem with that, but that's just not me. So I had to go out and understand the problem for myself. So you can find more about my book on this page. I've been really fortunate to have a ton of excerpts published and other stories about the plastic crisis in the past month since my book came out. And I have lots of events coming up, including the signing tomorrow, which I'm so excited about because it's one of the only in-person events I've had so far. So thank you. Let me get out of here. All right, anyone have questions?
Well, first of all, let me just thank you, Erica, for the presentation. That was really terrific. And I want to just put forward to the audience that we met when we both participated in a show in the spring highlighting the impact of the misuse of plastics and other things on the environment. And you had photographs similar to what you showed here today. And the photographs, some of the photographs are in the book. But you're doing incredibly important work, and your approach to integrate the science with the community, with the art, I think is really pivotal in trying to get the word out to people. And so thank you, and continued success with your work. For those on the group, please, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. And while you're reflecting on that, I just wanted to hear Erica maybe talk about any legislation, either locally or statewide or federally, that we might be able to be actively engaged in.
Right, great question. So right now, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is a big one in the US, and that's a national legislation. Local legislation is so variable. Right now in New York State, we're looking at an extended producer responsibility bill, which, as worded as is, many environmentalists are not very happy because they think it leaves many things out. So that's something that we might need to work more on before it is passed. But the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is a fairly comprehensive and I think a great attempt to address the intersectional and multifaceted issue of the plastic crisis, from environmental injustices to the need to just stop making so much plastic and stop using so much plastic, and waste management, and what we can really do to address the crisis in terms of what do we do with plastic? Because now, as you know, is like we can't really do too much with it that's useful, and recycling is just way underfunded, underdeveloped, and the recycling schemes that the industries are promoting is actually to turn plastic into fuel, which is going to create more fossil fuel emissions instead of finding a way to more circularly use plastic. So there's a lot on the table. But I would say the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act seems to have stalled for now, but if there is any way to educate yourself about it and maybe talk to your community about it, there could be another push to push that forward, because right now Europe has a very similar rule into effect. It's called the Single-Use Plastic Directive, and that's showing to be helpful. It's not similar in the way that it's specifically structured, but it has similar elements to it, because life in Europe and life in the US is a bit different, and it should have kind of a localized approach. But the same, intentions are there, and the same areas of improvement are there. So take a look at that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I saw Carl had his hand up, so Carl, please.
Yeah, hi.
Hi,
I'm
Carl.
here with my wife, Patricia, our dog, Katie, and our daughter, Alex.
Hey, everyone.
And I just wanted to say that this talk is about a book, and this book is very well written. It is not written like a lecture, and I'd like to put Erica on the spot and ask her to read something,
Okay, let's do it.
because the book sweeps the reader along, because Erica is a really great writer.
Thank you. Well, I learned from the best. Okay, I'm going to read a passage about the risk to marine wildlife, and specifically whales. I had a really nice whale friend visiting. She's a whale expert from California, and yeah, we had a good conversation about whales the other night and our concern for them, because we both love these creatures, and knowing that they're surrounded by plastic at all times. So I will read this passage.
What page?
This is on page 43. It's hard to get the book and my face in the Zoom, but we're gonna try this. Okay. While some marine animals like seabirds, fish, and corals may be attracted to eating plastic because it tricks them into believing it is food, other animals may not be aware or able to control whether or not they ingest it. This is the case for filter feeding animals of all sizes, from the blue whale, Earth's largest living animal, which can grow as long as 3 full-size school buses parked in a straight line, to blue mussels, which can fit comfortably in the palm of a human hand. These very different creatures both use their bodies to sieve small living organisms like krill and plankton out of large quantities of seawater. Because microplastic is roughly the same size and shape as filter feeders' food sources, it is easily, though unintentionally, incorporated into their diets. I gained some firsthand insight into the ubiquity of unintentional microplastic consumption in the seas a few years after Plastic Change's Los Angeles to Honolulu expedition, when Torsten and I sailed together again, this time around the western and north coast of Iceland. On that journey, arranged by Ocean Missions, a marine conservation organization newly founded by Spanish marine biologist Belén Garcia Ovide, we observed humpback, orca, minke, and sperm whales feeding in waters carrying considerable amounts of plastic. Hers would be among the first groups in Iceland to investigate local microplastic pollution. Despite the country's emergence as a tourism destination following the dramatic eruption of its volcano in 2010, and all the plastic the influx of visitors inevitably brought. While the Icelandic waters were not as polluted as the eastern North Pacific Gyre, they certainly contained microplastic. The remote frigid sea was also full of life, teeming with cod and capelin. Overall, it seemed our manta trawls were more likely to swallow seaweed, plankton, or fish eggs, favorite foods of marine creatures, than microplastic. However, this also meant microplastic was mixing with the whales' food, right where we witnessed whales actively searching for something to eat. I remember watching a small group of humpbacks, their barnacled, pleated chins swelling like bellows as they gushed great mouthfuls of seawater through enormous baleen-plated jaws, entrapping krill, capelin, copepods, and small fish. A filter-feeding adult humpback whale draws in nearly 19,000 liters of water and 1.5 metric tons of krill per day. As the crew observed the whales, Canadian marine biologist Charla Bassarin, who had also joined Ocean Mission's expedition, had remarked, "Wow, imagine how much plastic they trap in each gulp." Our trawls revealed that where sea life gathered, microplastic was also likely to intrude. The whales really could do nothing to avoid eating it. Surprisingly little research has been done to understand why microplastics and wildlife are congregating in the same areas of the ocean. However, scientists affiliated with the University of Siena in Italy have noted that in the northwestern Mediterranean, cool, nutrient-rich offshore currents appear to attract both plankton and microplastics into a key fin whale feeding ground, the Pelagos Sanctuary for Mediterranean marine mammals. Like humpbacks, fin whales use mouthfuls outfitted with baleen to filter plankton and small fish from seawater. If microplastic is aggregating in whales' feeding grounds, it's likely they're consuming it. Bassarin, who studies whales in Iceland, pointed out that the deep seas we were sailing also experienced much upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water. Off Iceland's northern coast, an unusual confluence of warm Atlantic and cold Arctic currents also seems to attract marine life and people. Where there's plankton and fish, whales and fishermen follow, Bassarin had said, pointing to several hulking fishing vessels looming nearby, spooling in their plastic longlines. From these Icelandic waters, we pulled out tiny nylon fibers, which we could clearly identify as pieces of fishing nets and lines. Like the gear being hauled up by the fishing boats, these lines were clear and blue. All across the world, non-human animals are suffering the consequences of humanity's plastic addiction far more quickly than we are learning of how exactly they, and perhaps also we, are being harmed. What's more, all the microplastic ingested by or entangling animals, in addition to that skimmed off the top layer of Earth's waterways, does not account for all the plastic that's expected to be in the oceans. To find the rest of humanity's missing plastic, scientists have had to dive deeper, probing for plastic out of sight below the surface. So that was the little passage you get for attending this talk. So yeah, that's my closer, because I mean, I started explaining, I got into the plastic issue way back when I was studying to be a wildlife rehabilitator and actively being a wildlife rehabilitator. So, the effect on wildlife is also really important to acknowledge. I mean, it's human suffering, it's wildlife suffering, the planet is suffering. So it's a problem that we all should feel invested to solve, I hope. Yeah.
So thank you for that question, Carl, because I just want to echo your comments and compliments about Erica's writing. The writing is terrific and it really draws people into the story. And I think that's so critical when we're talking about issues of this on this scale. So, kudos to you. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the process of actually shaping the book and bringing it out to, to the public, if you had how you did that, maybe a few words about that.
Well, thank you for the kind words about my writing. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so the process, again, I kind of followed the journey that I took, which is to start out on the ocean and work my way back to solutions. But to understand, where plastic comes from was a journey in itself, because of course it comes from gas and oil. So when I had a piece of the problem that was missing, I said, okay, I have to go to that place and find out. So when I knew that I needed to learn more about environmental injustice, I went to Louisiana. When I needed to know about plastic in the Arctic, I went to Iceland. And I was very fortunate to be able to meet such amazing people all over the world, sometimes by chance, and they could shed light on the problem and also solutions. If there's anything heartening that people should know, is that a lot of communities are doing really amazing work right now, and work that addresses the fundamental issues of plastic and not just put a band-aid over things. And so I tried to find out what I could about research being done. I met with scientists, but I also wanted to find community research. So I looked up projects where communities were doing work. And it happened very organically. It felt like I didn't have to search far to find really amazing people. So
Great, thank you. So please, if I don't know if there's other questions out there, but if so, please unmute yourself and ask.
Hey Erica, it's so great to hear you on here, and just so exciting to just be here and hear a bit of your excerpt. But I actually had a question, kind of a little more about hope that you might see. So doing a lot of work with younger kids and teaching about the plastic crisis. Are you by any chance seeing any trends with younger generations like Gen Z? Are you seeing like maybe more of an awareness, more of an involvement? I was just thinking how, I'm seeing brands are really targeting Gen Z right now. And I'm starting to see, I was actually just mentioning to Carl, and I'm just embarrassed to admit this, but McDonald's, they have moved towards paper straws as opposed to the plastic. So I think brands are starting to like try to catch on. And I've just heard a lot about Gen Z, but just wanting to know, are you seeing those trends with some younger generations?
I would say definitely I've found many young people are already aware of these issues, and they were like they're way younger than I was, and maybe you were, when we found out about plastic being a problem, and also their approach to like understanding what the solutions are will be different based on the understanding of the issue today. Because when we were growing up, Alex and I are about the same age. When we were growing up, recycling was still seen as like the #1 solution to plastic waste, even though now we know that recycling has largely been a failure. So we were told one thing, but now the truth is out there thanks to the work of these communities and scientists that have been paving the way and understanding the problem. So I do think that the awareness I've seen in the classroom is pretty high. I mean, honestly, some students are like, oh, I already signed a petition and now my school does not give out plastic forks and knives. And I'm like, wow, you're only 8 years old and you did this. So that's really cool. Yeah, I would say also students tell me that they're gonna, that they will or they have spoken to their parents, and then their parents often come to these events to pick them up and they're like, oh, now we can't have water bottles. Like the children actually have spoken to their parents about it. So that's really cool to see. And yeah, I mean, it is a time where luckily there's more truths coming out. And I think the more that we have conversations about it and speak with young people, I mean, that's what it's all about. The next generation needs to help us tackle this problem. So that's really important.
Great. Yeah, no, it's important. I mean, each generation has a part to play, and let's face it, my generation, while aware of it, and many of us on this call in that particular generation may have done some things. Ultimately, the generation has failed in its responsibilities. But we should wrap up. But you just made a statement that I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about, and you said recycling has failed. Because that was something that I think a lot of us were incredibly involved with and have been for decades in trying to do that. And why do you say that?
I would say, okay, to clarify, plastic recycling has failed. I'll say that because that's what I was referring to. Largely, the people that are supposed to be recycling things, our people, like the people, us, we are really good about recycling, really good. However, when the recycling gets to recycling center, there are things done to it that are out of our consent and are not recycling. Like incinerating is not recycling. Shipping it overseas and putting it in someone's backyard in Turkey is not recycling. So that's what I mean. I think that environmental groups and people who have awareness of the issue and communities generally, like people do want to do the right thing. I go out for a walk with my dog in the morning and I see everyone has recycling out, tons of recycling. It's great. You think you were doing the right thing. And it should be the right thing if recyclers were doing what they said that they would do.
Yeah,
That's the problem. Yeah.
it goes
So,
to the corporations.
yeah. I mean, and there is a big incentive to not handle trash because recycling is super expensive. And right now plastic is super abundant. So it's not really very economically smart to spend money doing that.
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah. Yeah, the markets are fickle and yeah, so that's a longer conversation, but
No,
listen,
but great. I'm glad that you brought it up because it is requiring clarification, because, and I don't want to think that past generations have failed. I think that there's a lot of issue with the corporations that are turning out plastic. And as I told you, they are silencing scientists. They were silencing journalists. They're putting out misinformation. I mean, these corporations have pushed recycling as well, and they form greenwashed organizations that do recycling. And it's a longer conversation, but there's a lot out there now that we didn't know 50 years ago because of the corporations push to keep things quiet.
yeah. Well, we can all continue that conversation tomorrow at Canio's from 2 to 3:30 when Erica will be there to sign books. And if you can't get to the store, but you would like a book signed or 2 or 3 to be able to give to people that you know, just give us a call or send us an email and we'll make sure that we get her to sign books for you. But Erica, this is terrific. We wish you continued success with your work and getting the word out about this. And we look forward to hearing about your next book or your next projects, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So
yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Marianne, any word that you'd like to send us home with?
Just, ditto all that. The book is really powerful. It is so well written. Your presentation tonight, Erica, was tremendously informative and moving and inspiring. We've all got to get engaged with this issue. So I'll just, thank our audience and kudos to you, Erica. I hope to see as many of you as can join us tomorrow afternoon at Canio's for the signing, and continued strength and power to you. So you've got it going, and we really appreciate your work. And thanks to Carl for introductions and all of our,
thank you. Always,
yeah, all of our wonderful guests. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.